In the tranquil North Cascades of Washington, a couple embarked on a simple overnight camping trip, only to vanish without a trace. Their secured vehicle was all that investigators found before the case went cold, their file left untouched for 4 years. The mystery finally cracked open in a distant forest when a logger, Brody Houston, attempted to move an old, rusted wood chipper from a remote track. As the machine shifted, its hidden contents were dislodged, sending the investigation in a new and disturbing direction. The first sign that something was wrong was a cascade of mail spilling from an aluminum box, a stark testament to the halted rhythm of the Klugman household. It was September 18, 2015. Roric Klugman stood on the front porch of his parents' modest home on the outskirts of Seattle, there for their weekly coffee tradition. A heavy silence hung over the property, feeling utterly wrong. He knocked, then rang the doorbell, but no one answered. Calls to his mother, Deline, and father, Roric, went straight to voicemail. Roric, 57, and Deline, 58, were creatures of habit, their retirement routines a predictable comfort. Roric, feeling a sense of dread, fumbled for the spare key hidden beneath a ceramic frog. As he unlocked the door and pushed it open, a wave of stale, overwhelming air rushed out to meet him. An acrid stench of animal waste burned his eyes. He stepped into the living room and froze. The house looked as if a small tornado had ripped through it. Furniture was overturned, and the sofa cushions were torn open, their stuffing scattered across the carpet like a fresh snowfall. Claw marks marred the wooden door frames, and the carpet was soiled beyond recognition. "Mom, Dad." Tyrion's voice was tight with fear as he moved through the wreckage. It looked like a break-in, yet the television remained on the wall, and his mother's jewelry box was untouched on a dresser. Then he heard it, a faint, piteous scratching from the back of the house. He followed the sound to the utility room. The door was closed, its bottom splintered and gouged. When he opened it, huddled in a corner on a dirty blanket, was the family's golden retriever, Sonny. The dog was barely recognizable, severely emaciated with ribs protruding sharply beneath matted fur. He was so dehydrated he could barely lift his head, and his water bowl was bone dry, covered in dust. The sight of Sonny shattered Tyrion's confusion and replaced it with pure terror. His parents adored Sonny. The idea that they would leave him locked up without food or water for long enough to nearly die and destroy the house in a desperate attempt to escape was inconceivable. It defied everything Tyron knew about them. It meant they hadn't simply left. Something catastrophic had prevented their return. Judging by the dog's condition, Tyron estimated they had been gone for at least a week. He immediately called 911. Within the hour, the house was an active crime scene as authorities began to trace the Klugman's last known movements. A shocked Tyran provided the initial timeline. His parents had planned a short getaway. On September 11th, exactly 1 week before, they had departed for a one-night camping trip to North Cascades National Park. It was meant to be a casual excursion. Roric and Deline enjoyed easy hikes and well-maintained campsites. They were not survivalists. This trip was supposed to be simple. Drive up, set up camp, hike a familiar trail, and return the next day. As the investigation got underway, standard procedures were followed, including gathering background information on the missing couple. Tyran helped investigators compile their medical histories and facilitated the collection of their dental records, routine steps in any long-term missing persons case. While searching the home for clues about their exact destination, investigators accessed Roric's cloud storage account, looking for recent activity. There, they found the last known evidence of Roric and Deline Klugman, a photograph, a selfie uploaded and timestamped the afternoon of September 11th. The image captured a moment of simple happiness. The sun was bright, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue framed by the towering pine trees of the North Cascades. Roric was on the left, his head tilted affectionately toward Deline. He wore a simple gray t-shirt, his sunglasses pushed into his dark hair, and a vibrant orange backpack strapped to his back. Deline, her blonde hair slightly windswept, smiled broadly, wearing a bright red jacket and a delicate silver beaded necklace. The metadata indicated the photo had synced to the cloud just moments before their phones likely lost service, swallowed by the vast, rugged wilderness of the national park. They had arrived. They were happy, and then they vanished. The North Cascades National Park complex is a sprawling, intimidating wilderness spanning over 684,000 acres of jagged peaks, deep valleys, dense forests, and more than 300 glaciers. It is a place of breathtaking beauty, but also profound danger. For search and rescue (SAR) teams, it presents a logistical nightmare. The search to find Roric and Deline Klugman was massive. By September 19th, teams from multiple counties, park rangers, and specialized volunteer groups converged on the area. However, they were at a severe disadvantage. The Klugmans had a 7-day head start. Scent trails were long gone, and footprints had been washed away by rain. The search area was essentially the entire park. The first critical objective was to locate their vehicle. Park rangers began a systematic check of every trailhead, parking lot, and scenic overlook. After nearly 48 hours of exhaustive searching, the Klugman's silver Subaru Outback was found at the Thunder Creek trailhead. The discovery provided the first tangible starting point for the investigation, but offered few answers. The car was locked and secured. Everything inside appeared normal. Snacks in the console, water bottles in the holders, and no signs of a struggle or distress. It looked exactly as one would expect if the owners had simply parked, geared up, and headed out for a hike. With the trailhead established, the ground search began in earnest. Teams fanned out along the Thunder Creek Trail, a relatively flat, well-maintained path that followed the creek deep into the valley. Given the Klugmans' casual hiking style, it was the most logical route. 9 units were deployed, though with low expectations given the time elapsed. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew low over the canopy, scanning for any heat signatures. Days turned into a week. Searchers battled exhaustion, difficult terrain, and the growing realization that they were looking for a needle in a haystack made of pine trees and granite. The mood among the teams was grim. In the wilderness, the margins for survival are thin. Tyran remained at the command post, waiting for any news. He provided details about his parents' gear, emphasizing the bright orange color of Roric's backpack, hoping it would provide a visual beacon. Then a break seemingly arrived. A hiker backpacking in a remote area several miles from the Thunder Creek Trail reported a sighting. While reviewing photos from his trip, he noticed something out of place in the distance. He contacted the command post, reporting a flash of bright orange fabric deep within a treacherous scree field high above the valley floor. The location was difficult to access, a steep slope of loose rock and debris far from any established trail. It was not a place casual hikers like the Klugmans would venture, but if they had become disoriented, it was possible. The report energized the command post. A specialized high-angle rescue team was assembled. The operation to reach the object was inherently risky. The scree field was unstable and prone to rockfall, and the weather was deteriorating. The team began the arduous ascent. The terrain required technical climbing skills. They moved slowly and deliberately, securing ropes and navigating the shifting ground. The tension was palpable. Every loose rock that clattered down the slope echoed through the valley. From the command post, observers monitored their progress through high-powered binoculars, the radio crackling with updates. It took the team nearly 6 hours to reach the location. They approached the object cautiously, anticipation immense. This could be the key to finding the Klugmans, the first piece of evidence that would explain what happened. The team leader reached the object and radioed in. The message was brief and deflating. The orange fabric was not Roric's backpack. It was an old, weathered piece of climbing gear, a faded sling that had been abandoned years ago. The disappointment was crushing. The risky operation had yielded nothing but more questions. Why had the Klugmans vanished without a trace? If they were lost, why hadn't they left any signs of distress, any dropped gear, any indication of their path? As the active search scaled back due to a lack of new leads and approaching winter weather, the investigation shifted focus. If the wilderness wouldn't provide answers, perhaps the Klugmans' life before the trip would. Detectives began a deeper dive into Roric and Deline's background. They were a quiet couple, well-liked by their neighbors, with no known enemies or financial troubles. They seemed to be enjoying their transition into retirement. However, one recent event stood out. Tyran revealed that Roric, a skilled machine technician, had recently lost his job at Van Camp Industries, a local manufacturing plant specializing in heavy industrial equipment. This was a significant life event, but according to Tyran, Roric had downplayed it, framing it as an early retirement opportunity with a severance package. He seemed optimistic. Investigators considered the possibility that the job loss had caused more stress than Roric let on. Had he been hiding financial difficulties? Had the pressure led to a domestic dispute during the camping trip? Or perhaps something darker, a suicide pact or an intentional disappearance? These theories were explored, but they didn't align with the couple's behavior or the evidence found. Their financial records showed they were stable, and their friends and family insisted they were deeply devoted to each other. As part of the routine investigation, detectives interviewed Roric's former employer, Oswin Van Camp, the owner of Van Camp Industries. Van Camp was cooperative and professional, expressing shock and concern. He confirmed Roric's layoff was due to redundancy, a necessary cost-cutting measure, and described Roric as a reliable employee with whom he had parted on amicable terms. The interview was unremarkable, and the detectives moved on. The lead regarding the job loss seemed to fade. With no evidence of foul play and no trace of the couple in the wilderness, the case stalled. The prevailing theory was that Roric and Deline had succumbed to the elements, their remains lost somewhere in the vast expanse of the North Cascades. Winter arrived, burying the park under feet of snow. The active search was officially suspended. The case of the missing Klugmans went cold. The years following the disappearance offered no answers, only a slow, gnawing ache of uncertainty. Tyran Klugman navigated a life suspended between grief and hope. The house was eventually cleaned and repaired, and Sonny was nursed back to health, but the absence of his parents remained a gaping wound. The case file sat dormant in the cold case unit, one of many mysteries swallowed by the Washington wilderness. Summer 2019 arrived, nearly 4 years after the Klugmans parked their Subaru and walked into the North Cascades. The landscape had changed. Fires had scarred some areas while new growth emerged in others. The memory of the massive search had faded. Brody Houston was a contract logger, a man accustomed to the solitude and hard labor of the forest. He was not working within the national park, but in an adjacent section of the national forest, a remote area characterized by steep slopes and thick undergrowth. His current contract involved clearing debris and overgrowth from a network of decommissioned logging access roads. It was mundane, grueling work intended to maintain firebreaks and manage forest resources. Houston spent his days navigating the rutted, half-forgotten roads in his heavy-duty flatbed truck, equipped with a winch and chainsaws. The air was thick with the smell of pine, damp earth, and diesel fumes. He was clearing a particularly overgrown section of road, a narrow track that hadn't been used in years. The vegetation was so dense it formed a canopy over the road, casting the area in perpetual shadow. He maneuvered his truck around a sharp bend, the tires slipping on the muddy ground. It was there, half hidden by the undergrowth, that he spotted something out of place. It was a piece of abandoned machinery, a portable wood chipper. It was tilted at an awkward angle, its wheels half sunk into the soft earth. It was clear it had been there for a very long time. The paint, once a bright industrial orange, was now faded, chipped, and covered in large patches of rust. The engine block was coated in dried mud and grease. The feeding chute was heavily rusted, and a protective guard was bent and broken. It looked inoperable, a piece of junk. It was an eyesore, and part of the debris he was contracted to manage. He considered leaving it. It was heavy, rusted, and buried in mud. But Houston took pride in his work and decided to haul it out and take it to a disposal site. He returned to his truck and unspooled the winch cable. He was working alone that day. He dragged the heavy cable through the mud and secured it around the chipper's frame. He engaged the winch, the motor straining against the machine's weight and the suction of the mud. The wood chipper groaned, the rusted metal protesting as it was dragged from its resting place. After several attempts, Houston managed to haul the machine onto the access road. Now the challenge was getting it onto the flatbed truck. He backed the truck up to the chipper, positioning it for a direct lift. He reattached the winch cable, aiming to lift the front end onto the bed and then pivot the rest up. He engaged the winch again. The cable went taut. The front of the wood chipper lifted off the ground, swinging precariously. Houston maneuvered the controls carefully, lifting it higher. As the chipper reached its peak, it tilted sharply upward. The sudden, steep angle shifted the contents of the machine. Deep within the rusted feeding chute, compacted material that had been lodged in the mechanism for years was dislodged by the sudden change in gravity. A clump of debris fell from the chute, landing on the muddy ground near Husted's boots. He looked down, expecting to see a compacted mass of wood pulp, leaves, and dirt. But what he saw was perplexing. The clump was dark and degraded. Kneeling down, he carefully examined it, poking at it with a stick. It wasn't just organic matter. He noticed small, dense, hard fragments mixed into the compacted dirt. Husted felt a sudden chill, despite the humid forest air. This was different from wood pulp. Reaching into the feeding chute, he probed deeper into the mechanism. He pulled out another handful of the material. Embedded within it were small, hard objects that looked disturbingly familiar. He stood up, his heart pounding. He wasn't a forensic expert, but he had spent his life in the wilderness and knew what decomposed organic material looked like. This was distinct. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This machine hadn't just been used to chip wood. Alarmed and deeply disturbed, Houston immediately stopped the operation. He left the wood chipper hanging precariously from the winch, suspended between his truck and the ground. He climbed into the cab, his hands shaking, and radioed his base, reporting an unusual discovery. He didn't elaborate on his suspicions, but his tone conveyed the urgency of the situation. He requested immediate contact with the state police. The discovery of the rusted machine, deep in the remote wilderness, had just broken open the cold case of Roric and Deline Klugman. The response to Brody Husted's call was swift and significant. The previously forgotten access road was suddenly transformed into a major crime scene. State police and forensic teams descended on the location, navigating the difficult terrain to reach the spot where the wood chipper hung suspended. The area was secured, marked off with yellow tape. The rusted and grime-covered wood chipper became the central focus of the investigation. The first task was to meticulously document and collect the material that had fallen from the chute. The hard fragments were carefully photographed in their place before being collected and packaged as evidence. The forensic team then began the arduous process of dismantling the wood chipper, examining every component for potential evidence. It quickly became clear that the machine had been used for something far more sinister than landscaping. Embedded within the mechanism and coating the blades were traces of biological material. But the discovery extended beyond the machine itself. The area where the wood chipper had rested for years became the next focus. Investigators realized that if the machine had been used to process remains, the surrounding environment would likely contain ejected material. A large area around the discovery site was cordoned off. The forensic team began a painstaking search of the forest floor, which was covered in a thick layer of decaying leaves, mud, and undergrowth. The search required getting down on hands and knees, systematically clearing vegetation and screening the soil. The process was slow and grueling. The team used fine mesh screens, sifting through the dirt and debris, looking for anything that didn't belong. The work continued for days, hampered by the remote location and difficult conditions. The search yielded horrifying results. Scattered throughout the soil and leaf litter, embedded in the mud and hidden among the roots, were highly fragmented biological remains. The level of destruction was extreme. The mechanical action of the wood chipper, combined with 4 years of exposure to the elements, had severely degraded the material. The remains were collected, documented, and sent to the state crime lab for analysis. The initial findings confirmed the investigators' worst fears. The remains were human. The critical question now was identification. Who was the victim? The forensic anthropologists at the lab faced a significant challenge. The remains were so fragmented and degraded that reconstructing a biological profile was difficult. They noted that the total volume of remains recovered was alarmingly small, far too little to account for even one complete adult body. Furthermore, the fragments were primarily from smaller bones, including cranial and finger bones, rather than the larger bones of the torso or limbs. This suggested a terrifying possibility. They were likely only looking at partial remains, disposed of in a manner meant to erase identity, while the rest of the bodies were elsewhere. They attempted to extract DNA, hoping for a match in the national databases. However, the degradation and contamination from the environment and the rusted machine made extracting a viable DNA profile impossible. The DNA was too damaged, the samples too compromised. The investigation had hit a wall. They had human remains and evidence of a brutal homicide, but no identity, and the unsettling knowledge that this was only a fraction of the victims. Faced with the failure of DNA analysis, the investigators returned to the scene. They needed something more, something that had survived the mechanical destruction and the passage of time. They expanded the search perimeter, using metal detectors and conducting an even more rigorous screening of the soil. A second sweep was initiated. The team worked meticulously, driven by the urgency of identifying the victim. They knew that any metal objects, jewelry, surgical implants, or dental work might have survived where organic material had not. The metal detectors pinged repeatedly, mostly yielding old nails, discarded shell casings, and other metallic debris common in logging areas. But then, embedded deep in the soil, a strong signal registered. The team carefully excavated the area, uncovering a small metallic object. After being carefully cleaned and examined, it was identified as a piece of dental work, a uniquely crafted silver dental inlay. It was a critical discovery. The investigators now had a tangible piece of evidence, but they still needed to connect it to a specific person. Given the location of the discovery adjacent to the North Cascades National Park and the fact that Roric and Deline Klugman had disappeared for years prior, investigators immediately prioritized their file. The Klugman case was the most prominent unsolved missing persons case in that specific region, making it the most logical connection. They retrieved the dental records that had been collected during the initial 2015 investigation. A forensic odontologist was called in to compare the recovered silver inlay against the dental charts of both Roric and Deline. The comparison against Delphine's records yielded no match. The odontologist then turned to Roric's file. The challenge was that the inlay was not a complete tooth. It was a fragment of a larger dental appliance. A traditional bite match or comparison based on tooth morphology was impossible. However, Roric's dental charts contained detailed notes and diagrams from his dentist, documenting the unique craftsmanship and specific metallurgical composition of the silver inlay he had received years earlier. The forensic odontologist conducted a detailed analysis of the recovered inlay, comparing its specific characteristics, the precise curvature, the unique tool marks, and the composition of the silver alloy against the detailed descriptions in Roric's dental history. The match was positive. The unique characteristics of the silver inlay confirmed with a high degree of certainty that it belonged to Roric Klugman. The discovery provided the first definitive proof of Roric Klugman's fate. He was deceased, the victim of a brutal homicide. His remains were partially disposed of using the wood chipper. The case was officially reopened as a homicide investigation. The question of where the rest of him and Deline were located became the investigation's central haunting mystery. The investigation briefly considered an alternative theory, that Roric had recently lost his job, creating a rift in the marriage, and Deline had murdered him and then fled. Investigators explored this possibility, but the theory didn't hold up. The brutal and calculated method of disposal suggested organization and violence that seemed unlikely for Deline acting alone. Furthermore, there was no evidence that she had accessed their finances or made any preparations to disappear. The focus shifted back to the more likely scenario. Both Roric and Deline were victims of a targeted attack. The discovery of the wood chipper and Roric's partial remains had confirmed the how. But the critical questions remained. Why and who was responsible for this calculated brutality? The news that his father's remains had been identified hit Roric Klugman with the finality of a death sentence. The agonizing uncertainty of the past 4 years was replaced by the horrific reality of the wood chipper and the sickening realization that only fragments had been found. The brutality of the disposal method suggested a level of violence and calculation that went far beyond an accidental death. It felt organized, targeted, and designed to erase them completely. Devastated but driven by a desperate need for answers, Roric began his own investigation. He focused on the one anomaly in his parents' otherwise quiet life, Roric's recent job loss. He knew his father had downplayed the circumstances, framing it as an early retirement. But what if there was more to the story? What if the job loss was the key to understanding why someone would want his parents dead? Roric began meticulously examining his parents' financial records. He spent weeks going through bank statements, credit card bills, and investment accounts, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Signs of financial distress or hidden debts that might explain the pressure Roric might have been under. Instead, he found the opposite. Buried in the bank statements from the week before the disappearance, Roric discovered a massive anomaly. Roric had made a cash withdrawal of $50,000. The discovery stunned Roric. His parents were financially conservative. They didn't deal in large amounts of cash. A $50,000 withdrawal was highly uncharacteristic and represented a significant portion of their liquid assets. Where had the money gone? It wasn't in the house, and it hadn't been deposited in another account. It had simply vanished along with his parents. The discovery of the cash raised alarming possibilities. Was it a payoff? Blackmail? Had Roric been involved in something illegal? The questions tormented Roric, but he refused to believe his father was a criminal. He had to understand the context of that withdrawal. He turned his attention back to Van Camp Industries, needing to understand the true nature of his father's dismissal. He decided to contact Roric's former colleagues, the men he had worked alongside for decades. But he encountered a wall of silence. The people he spoke to were evasive, their responses brief and guarded. They expressed sympathy for his loss, but when the conversation turned to Van Camp Industries and Roaric's departure, the tone shifted. There was an underlying atmosphere of fear. They spoke in hushed tones, mentioning concerns about retaliation from the company and the need to protect their jobs. None of them would confirm the official story of the downsizing. They simply wouldn't talk about Oswin Van Camp. The pervasive fear surrounding Van Camp Industries only fueled Tieren's suspicion. Something was wrong at that company, and his father had been caught in the middle of it. He intensified his efforts, digging through his father's old work files, contracts, manuals, notes, looking for anything related to Van Camp Industries. He was becoming consumed by the investigation, driven by the conviction that the answers lay hidden within the company's secrets. Then the pressure escalated. Tiran returned to his apartment one evening after spending hours at the library. As he unlocked the door, he immediately felt that something was off. The air inside felt disturbed. He stepped into the living room. The apartment hadn't been ransacked like his parents' house. It was subtle but unmistakable. The boxes containing his parents' financial documents and his father's old work files, which he kept stacked in his home office, had been rifled through. The lids were askew, the files slightly rearranged. He checked the rest of the apartment. Nothing of value was stolen. His electronics were untouched, and the cash in his wallet was undisturbed. This wasn't a burglary. It was a message. Someone knew what he was looking for, and they were looking for it too. Tiran reported the break-in to the police, but without any stolen property or signs of forced entry. Whoever had entered had picked the lock. The police dismissed it as an unrelated incident, a neighborhood burglary attempt that had been interrupted. Tiran knew better. The connection to his investigation was undeniable. The break-in left him feeling violated and exposed. He was no longer just investigating a cold case. He was actively engaged in a confrontation with something dangerous. A few days later, the confrontation turned violent. It was late evening. Tiran was returning home, pulling into the underground parking garage of his apartment building. The garage was dimly lit, the concrete walls echoing the sound of his engine. He parked his car and got out, his mind preoccupied with the $50,000 withdrawal and the fear surrounding Van Camp Industries. He didn't see the man until it was too late. A large figure emerged from the shadows between two pillars. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with an intimidating presence. Before Tiran could react, the man was on him. The attack was swift and brutal. The man grabbed Tiran by the throat and slammed him against the side of his car. The impact knocked the wind out of him. He gasped for air, struggling against the man's powerful grip. The man leaned in close, his face inches from Tiran's. "Stop digging," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. Tiran tried to fight back, but he was overpowered. The man delivered a series of punishing blows to his ribs and stomach. Tiran collapsed to the concrete floor, writhing in pain. The man stood over him, his expression cold and detached. "The files, where are they?" Tiran, struggling to breathe, refused to answer. The man delivered a final brutal kick to his ribs. "This is your only warning. Stop digging into Van Camp business, or you'll end up like your old man." The threat hung in the air, chilling and explicit. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, the man vanished into the shadows, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty garage. Tiran lay on the cold concrete, injured and shaken, but the assault had galvanized his resolve. The threat against him, the specific mention of Van Camp business, was the confirmation he needed. He dragged himself to his feet and called the police. This time they couldn't dismiss it. The targeted intimidation, the violent assault, the direct connection to Van Camp Industries. It forced the police to finally acknowledge what Tiran had suspected all along. Roaric's employment was inextricably linked to his murder. The investigation was no longer just about a missing couple. It was about a conspiracy that reached far beyond the wilderness of the North Cascades. The violent assault on Roric Klugman changed the trajectory of the investigation entirely. What had been a localized homicide case, focused on the discovery of Roaric's partial remains in the wilderness, suddenly expanded into a complex financial conspiracy. The specific threat regarding Van Camp business acted as a catalyst, forcing authorities to look beyond the surface of Roaric's dismissal and scrutinize the operations of Van Camp Industries. The case was elevated to a joint investigation, bringing together homicide detectives from the state police and the specialized expertise of the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. The focus shifted intensely onto Oswin Van Camp, the seemingly respectable owner of the manufacturing plant. The investigation began by following the money. The FBI launched a full forensic audit of Van Camp Industries' financial records, searching for anything that looked like illegal activity. This was no easy task, as Van Camp was a large, well-established company with a complex financial structure. The breakthrough came when they examined the company's insurance claims. They found a pattern of anomalies that suggested a massive fraud operation. Van Camp Industries, which specialized in heavy industrial machinery, had filed an unusually high number of claims for damaged or stolen equipment over the past decade, totaling millions of dollars. On the surface, the claims looked legitimate, backed by detailed paperwork and police reports. But when the accountants cross-referenced the serial numbers of the lost equipment, they uncovered the truth. The machinery wasn't damaged or stolen. Oswin Van Camp was systematically hiding it. Van Camp had orchestrated an elaborate shell game. He would report a piece of expensive equipment as lost or damaged, collect the multi-million-dollar insurance payout, and then move the machinery off the books. Investigators traced the equipment to a network of shell corporations Van Camp controlled, which owned unmarked warehouses outside the city. The lost equipment was either sold on the black market or used in off-the-books operations, generating even more illegal revenue. The scale of the fraud was staggering, and it provided the context for Roric Klugman's murder. Roric was the lead technician who maintained and logged the very equipment Van Camp was reporting as stolen. He was in a unique position to notice the inconsistencies, that supposedly decommissioned equipment was still operational, or that machinery reported stolen was simply missing from inventory logs. He would have known the numbers didn't add up. The $50,000 cash withdrawal Tyran had discovered was no longer a mystery. It was likely a payoff. Roric had found the fraud, and Van Camp had tried to buy his silence. But Van Camp panicked, convinced Roric would eventually expose him, and the motive for the murder became clear. Roric posed an existential threat to Van Camp's multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. With the fraud exposed and the motive established, the investigation turned to finding the accomplice. They needed to identify the man who had assaulted Tyran in the parking garage, the muscle behind Van Camp's operation. Interviews with former Van Camp employees kept bringing up the name Jory Pasternak. Pasternak, a former security foreman known as Van Camp's enforcer, had a history of violence and left the company shortly after Roaric's dismissal. Investigators located Pasternak and placed him under surveillance. He matched the physical description of Tyran's attacker, and Tyran positively identified him in a photo lineup. The net was closing in. The FBI needed to connect the fraud directly to the homicide, and the key was in the shell corporations and hidden warehouses. They traced the transactions to several warehouses and focused on a large, unmarked one south of Seattle, a central hub for the operation. A surveillance team was deployed, monitoring the site 24/7. After days of no activity, the team saw a luxury sedan, belonging to Oswin Van Camp, and a large panel truck, driven by Jory Pasternak, arrive. They watched as the two men entered the warehouse, turning on the lights and beginning to move heavy machinery. It was clear Van Camp and Pasternak were trying to empty the warehouse and destroy evidence. The FBI had caught them in the act. The time had come to act. They couldn't risk losing the evidence, so an immediate tactical operation was ordered. FBI tactical teams, supported by state police, converged on the industrial park. The element of surprise was critical. Van Camp and Pasternak had no idea they were surrounded. The warehouse, a massive corrugated metal structure, was breached simultaneously at multiple access points. Tactical teams flooded the building, their movements precise and coordinated. The entry achieved complete surprise. Oswin Van Camp, supervising the loading, froze in shock. Jory Pasternak, who was operating a forklift, slammed the machine into reverse, trying to create a barricade. The standoff was brief, as officers quickly outmaneuvered him. Pasternak surrendered and was subdued. Van Camp made a desperate attempt to flee, but was intercepted by a second tactical team and apprehended. Both men were arrested and secured. The warehouse was a graveyard of lost machinery. Excavators, bulldozers, and specialized manufacturing tools filled the vast space. Each piece represented a fraudulent insurance claim. The serial numbers matched the claims, providing undeniable physical proof of the fraud. Investigators also found several pieces of equipment that Roric Klugman had personally maintained, cementing the connection between the fraud and his knowledge. Secured in handcuffs, Oswin Van Camp remained arrogant and defiant, demanding his lawyers and denying all allegations. He seemed to believe his wealth and influence would protect him. Jory Pasternak, however, presented a different demeanor. Isolated from Van Camp in a separate interrogation room, he wasn't the mastermind. The investigators laid out the overwhelming evidence against him: the fraud, Tyrion's positive identification, and the surveillance footage. He was facing decades in prison, and then they introduced the homicide charges. They connected the fraud to the murders of Roric and Deline Klugman, presenting the grim reality of the wood chipper and the missing remains. They made it clear Van Camp would likely sacrifice Pasternak to save himself. Faced with the prospect of life imprisonment, Pasternak's loyalty to Van Camp evaporated. He requested a deal and agreed to confess everything. In the sterile interrogation room, Jory Pasternak detailed the events of 2015, providing the final, horrifying answers. He confirmed that Roric had discovered the fraud and confronted Van Camp. Van Camp fired Roric and offered him a $50,000 payoff, along with a threat to harm his family if he exposed the fraud. Roric, terrified, accepted the money and agreed to remain silent. Despite Roric's agreement, Van Camp panicked, convinced he would eventually be exposed. He ordered Pasternak to help him eliminate the threat permanently. They began stalking the Klugmans, and when they learned of their camping trip, they followed them to the North Cascades. Late one night, they ambushed and murdered the couple at their campsite. Pasternak confessed that they transported the bodies to a remote, dilapidated warehouse Van Camp owned. Inside, they used industrial saws and axes to dismember the bodies, meticulously separating the heads, hands, and feet, the parts crucial for identification. They drove the torsos and limbs to an abandoned mineshaft deep in the Cascade foothills, dumping them into a crevasse. Pasternak was then tasked with disposing of the identifying parts. He drove alone, and that's when he stumbled upon the wood chipper. Believing the machine would erase their identities forever, he managed to get the old engine running and processed the partial remains through it. He then abandoned the chipper where he found it. Pasternak's confession confirmed Delphine's fate alongside Roaric's, though the majority of their remains were never recovered. In late 2020, despite his high-powered legal team, the evidence against Oswin Van Camp was overwhelming. He was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and massive fraud, receiving life imprisonment without parole. Jory Pasternak, in exchange for his testimony, received a reduced sentence, but would still spend decades behind bars.